Hi, I'm Alex Miller, and this is the Citi Institute podcast, where we explore the forces shaping finance and the global economy. We bring you insights from thought leaders and innovators to help you stay informed and seize opportunities in a rapidly evolving world.
I'm very focused on doing the right AI and doing AI right.
Gemini 3 is taking us closer to this world where anything is infinitely remixable.
So today I'm super excited. We've got two such distinguished guests joining us today. First up, we've got Logan Kilpatrick, lead product manager at Google DeepMind. And with Logan, we have Shobhit Varshney, head of AI here at Citi. Together, we're going to try to unpack where we are today in the AI journey, what's especially exciting and what to look out for going forward in terms of how AI will help enterprises, but also wider society. So let's set the scene here. Shobhit, give us an introduction. Could you share your role and I guess your mission in joining Citigroup as global head of AI?
Hey, thanks so much, Alex, for having me. Well, I've been a big fan of the podcast. And Logan, thanks for joining us today. I serve as the global head of AI at Citi. I'm very focused on doing the right AI and doing AI right. So from a business perspective, doing the right AI means taking a very disciplined approach to driving growth, efficiency, and delivering some exceptional experiences, not just for our clients, but also for our colleagues. We are focusing more on the end-to-end process reengineering versus just incremental automation. And from a doing AI right perspective, we are embedding responsible AI principles, risk guardrails, controls across from ideation all the way to scale. And we're doing this with a very centralized Citi AI platform that powers all of our generative AI across the firm. So that's the overall mission for what we're trying to do. And Citi it's been an absolute privilege and blessing to be here at Citi at this point in time of where we are in our trajectory.
Well, there's lots I'm sure we're going to hear from you in terms of the ongoing journey. But maybe, Logan, I could turn to you. Google DeepMind has been integral to the development of AI these last 15 years. I guess we had AlphaGo, the first TPU, many other milestones. Can you just remind us some of those key milestones to date? Put us into context of the span of, let's call it, recent history, and where you feel we are today in that journey, particularly from your vantage point of having worked at both OpenAI and now Google. And obviously it feels with, obviously we've got Nano Banana Pro, Gemini 3, that we're at a particularly important moment now.
Yeah, it's a little bit dizzying. So I'll try to give the super high level cliff notes of this. I think Google's been an AI company for the last 10 years. I think the interesting thread that I see folks pull on often is how AI showed up in our products, I think has changed fundamentally. I think if you look back to the Transformer is one example of this back in 2017, created by a bunch of folks in Google Brain and throughout Google. And for a long time, that's actually been powering a bunch of the Google core Google search experience of how results show up and things like that. And then I think in the most recent era, you see all of the core Gemini products and models showing up across all of Google. And this is actually the most interesting thing I think now is, historically, you'd have all of these, and I'm curious for you all at Citi as well, if this is a consistent thread, and it sounds like it is actually. Historically, you'd have sort of all of this piecemeal AI that would show up in all these very, very specific circumstances. And it's actually a lot of work in order to make that happen. There's a huge amount of product complexity, engineering complexity, and now you sort of have these models, and for us at Google, it's Gemini that's sort of spanning the entire product portfolio. And there's really one model that can power, potentially everything from search to Google Docs to, external developers through our third-party APIs and stuff like that. So I think that is the newest and most interesting sort of twist of this AI story. And again, obviously DeepMind and Google have been pushing the frontier from a research standpoint, but this broad billion plus user scale deployment that's happening across many Google products now, I think is an interesting new flavor of the story.
And just remind us where we've come from as well, sort of 2010. For some people, this is a very recent phenomena, last 1 or 2 years, but it's not, is it?
Yeah, it's definitely not. And I think a lot of this started Google Brain back in, I think they started Google Brain 2014 or 2012 or something like that. And basically at the time, Google was hey, we sort of see the advancement that's happening in AI. Let's go get all the sort of researchers who are excited about these random research directions, bring them into a place, give them the resources, the compute to sort of scale up these experiments. And that led to tons of the breakthroughs. Again, the sort of one of the big ones is Transformers. And then at the same time, Google was also supporting DeepMind. They did the DeepMind acquisition. I think That was in 2016. And DeepMind at the time was sort of pushing the frontier of RL and sort of trying to come up with new ways to scale that architecture and to scale deep learning. And then in 2020, I think 2021, 2022, you saw the fusing of both of these research groups plus Google research coming together to sort of make this powerhouse that now sort of, powers all of Google basically with the AI work that's happening. And the fun part is, and again, this was a Google brain, Jeff Dean and a bunch of other folks betting on like customized compute hardware. So now we're on our 7th generation TPU, which I think is also a thing that is in the news a lot these days because Google has such a unique full stack approach. It's not like we're buying a bunch of stuff off the shelf from other people to power the AI work that we're doing. It is truly like building everything down from the silicon to the models to the product experience.
It's incredible vertical integration, isn't it?
Yeah, it's awesome. It's a beautiful story, and I think you needed to have made that bet 10 years ago. I think there's a lot of folks who are sort of making that bet now, which makes sense. But I think to see it in as fruitful of a way as hopefully we'll see it for Google, you needed to have made that bet a long time ago.
That's fascinating. Maybe, Shobhit, I can sort of turn to you. And obviously, you've got extraordinary experience when you were at IBM, and now you've obviously joined Citigroup. Can you just give us a sense of the background on the partnership with Google here at Citi and how that collaboration works, I guess, in practice? Obviously, there's a number of different platforms we must be leveraging, whether it's the cloud, Google Cloud, Vertex AI, supporting what you're obviously looking to lead across the firm.
Yeah, and we've had a multi-year, very strategic agreement with Google. Last year, we announced that Citi is migrating multiple workloads, applications, all of that stuff to Google Cloud's infrastructure. But specifically on AI, Google has been part of Citi's AI journey every step along the way. We've rolled out a lot of AI tools for our own colleagues, namely Citi Stylus, which lets you access broad productivity tools to have different workflows. We have Citi Assist, Citi Squad for our developers. We've rolled out these to about 180,000 colleagues globally across 84 plus countries. We have about 5,000 of our colleagues who have access to agentic AI workflows inside of Stylus as well. Beyond the broad productivity tools for our colleagues, we're also, this partnership has helped us embed more of the Citi AI into the business and functional processes as well. So very specific, specialized AI use cases that cut across the gamut of things across Citi. Customer care, wealth management, services, markets, operational workflows across the board, we're able to go infuse Gemini models across and transform how we do work. And Logan, just a big shout out to the Google DeepMind team. I think these guys are doing some phenomenal work with us. And particularly where we are starting to reimagine and pushing the boundaries of what the future of enterprise AI is going to look like together. I think there's been a lot of learnings that have come out of our DeepMind work as well.
It's fascinating. There's so much. Obviously, we get to use Stylus every day in what we're doing. It's so helpful on lots of different layers. Maybe Logan, I can sort of turn to you. You've been leading the charge, if I can use that phrase, in terms of developer relations, whole suite of products, including Gemini. If you think about the last 12 to 18 months, in other kind of parallels, that feels like the last 5 years, but the last 12 to 18 months, so much has been going across the whole AI landscape. What particularly as enterprises are thinking about adoption, what do you think is sort of particularly noteworthy and perhaps the experiences you've had from speaking to your customers?
Yeah, AI definitely feels like dog years. I think back to like
dog years. I like that.
Yeah, just 3 years ago, sort of the whole, I think more like in the spotlight, this moment started. Obviously, it's been going on for 10 years now behind the scenes, but within the last 3 years has gained the spotlight, and I feel like I've aged like 15 years in the last 3 years, which is unfortunate.
Well, you're looking better than most of us, so you're good there.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. I think the interesting trend, and I think this is actually accelerating in this present moment that we're in right now, like post Gemini 3 and Nano Banana Pro, is I think there was this like skepticism, or obviously there was like this the ebbs and flows of like the enthusiasm about AI, and specifically actually in the enterprise context. I think the initial moment happened, sort of lots of enterprises were like, we need to go and do a bunch of stuff now. Let's try to figure out what that strategy looks like. A lot of early shots on goal, a lot of prototyping, a lot of experimentation, and then sort of maybe a lot of realization that like you actually have to do a lot of work to make these systems successful in production and create value for whatever your product is and whoever your customers are. And I think at the same time that was happening, obviously the model progress doesn't stop. And part of my worldview had been that like a lot of that we as a company have to do a lot of work in order to get the models to do useful things was an artifact of the models just actually not being super robust. And there's this notion of like the models actually eating the scaffolding layer. So there was sort of this LLM language model 1.0 product deployments, which sort of happened in sort of early mid 2024. And actually, as you talk to a lot of those customers today of like what their product and the way that they've built AI systems look like now with models like Gemini 3, it's completely different. Like basically you had to build all of this system to make these models useful and reliable. And I think the model actually is much more robust now out of the box and does a lot more of that stuff for you. So where you need to spend the scaffolding time and like that investment has actually moved. And I think in a positive way has moved to things that are like higher value for, what does the product experience actually look like? It's less of like, let me do all this weird stuff around the model to try to get it to actually be useful for me. It's like, how can I make it so that the experience is pleasant to use and sort of fast and all this other stuff. So I think that's been like on the enterprise side, the biggest transition. And then in parallel to that happening, there's just this explosion of new capabilities. I think NanoBanana Pro is actually a great one where it's like not on the roadmap necessarily for like, at face value, like how does an image generation model benefit Citi?
Yes, the marketing teams, yes, the brand teams, multiple
100%.
areas.
Yeah, so useful, so interesting. So I think we'll continue to see that like new capability innovation keep happening, which I think will keep everyone on their toes, including us, and just like keep unlocking lots of new use cases.
I think, Logan, to your point about the continuous improvement, we have this thing within Citi on our stylus as well. If somebody tries a particular use case today, and maybe it's not 100% where you want it to be, just come back in a few weeks and you just be generally surprised by how well the models have started to perform. Just the weekly progress that we're making across these models has been phenomenal. And at the back end, we obviously start to integrate more and more of our Citi systems into it. So that way your query is now pulling from information from all the places that you care about, giving all of that context back to the models, and models themselves getting better and stuff. I think we're in a very nice feedback loop here right now.
It is really cool. And just to double down on this point, I think about this all the time. And this is another one of those like funny threads. If you look back 2.5 years ago, there was this notion that, it was a bad thing if you were using other people's models. And you were a wrapper, there's no value being created, all of this stuff. And as I think about like for my own my personal world right now, like if I had to leave Google tomorrow and start a startup, I would be absolutely thrilled to be building on these models. Because the beauty is like if you're building a product that fundamentally gets better because the models themselves get better, you're getting that innovation for free. Like there is literally nothing there is like a little bit of work that, you need to run evals and do that type of stuff. That's sort of a fixed cost of using AI models today, but like you get, the benefactors of all of this massive amount of CapEx and investment that's happening on the research and deployment side, if you're building on top of these models. And I think it's such a cool thing to see that like every 2 weeks, the use case that didn't work before might now actually work is such a cool thing that I don't think we've seen that level of like change. And it's actually hard sometimes as a user of these models because you're like, and I feel this way with Gemini 3. I tweeted this the other day. I used to have to like be very precise. I'm like, just do this one thing for me because otherwise it might mess up and, make the wrong decisions. And now I'm like, do that one thing, maybe do 5 other things. Okay. And then do 5 more things as well on top of that. And the model just crushes it, which is definitely like a mental model shift for me as I've been using this technology.
That mental model shift, that's a really interesting kind of phrase to use there because some of the early movers back in kind of early 24 amongst corporate or investor clients, they didn't always have, as you put it, that scaffolding quite right. And so the experience for some was not kind of what they wanted it to be. And I guess what you're saying is you've got to come back. It's not like that MIT study that says sort of 95% of enterprise applications don't work because that's just such a narrow definition. But your point is the world is moving so quickly.
Yeah, 100%. And I think also there's another thread on this scaffolding story, which is, and you see this more and more playing out now, the way like the models are really capable in and of themselves, but the scaffolding actually really matters. And I don't know for both of you, like as as you try the model in all of these different product placements, it can feel like visibly and viscerally different in sort of how the models interact, and sort of produce answers and do work on your behalf. And I think we're going to see that trend accelerate. And I think it'll be interesting to see like, there's a good example of this, which is like employees at Citi, for example, like using your internal product, how they might experience Gemini versus like how they might experience Gemini out of like in a, first party consumer product or elsewhere across other products. There's something interesting there. And I'm curious to see how people adapt to like how vastly different and positive or negative the experience could actually be because of how much the scaffolding influences these models now.
And a lot of filtering and a lot of guardrails around it. The processes in financial institutions, we have to have the right set of guardrails. So absolutely, we do. And that's one of the advantages of working with you as one of our partners. So we can actually solve for those problems together.
And just because there'll be some listeners who are not familiar with what the kind of concept of scaffolding is, can you describe how you think of that, Logan?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, and maybe I'm sort of being too cavalier with scaffolding, but like I think of like there's a base model, it's like trained, it has a fix, it's like literally like a frozen set of weights. It doesn't like it is a static artifact, and then everything around it that influences like additional context. So if you have like some context engineering system, you want to pull in, data from your drive or something like that and give it to the model, or custom system instruction tuning, or if you're doing like actual fine tuning of the models for like really custom deployments, the agent harness, all this stuff, like there's so much now.
So that whole environment is not in isolation is the point.
Yeah, the whole package. And I think that stuff like so dramatically impacts, again, in a positive way in a lot of cases, what the model is actually capable of doing, how useful it is, how relevant the answers are. So there's a huge amount of innovation that I think you can do at that level, which is, I think as the interesting trend is as the model becomes more capable itself, how much like area for improvement you have with the scaffolding actually increases, which is like not what you would necessarily expect. You'd expect like the models get better, therefore like the value for scaffolding goes down over time because there's a fixed ceiling, but it's actually not the case. Like the model is able to more fluidly adapt to that environment and like make use of that additional context and that system that you have, which is super exciting and cool to see.
And is that the point, Shobhit, that in large complex enterprises, and Citi's a big global firm, 180,000 employees around the firm, is that the point that as we begin to understand how to use the models more and more, it's not just the use cases, it's kind of rethinking everything that's done?
Yeah, so let me just give you a quick view on how we're thinking about AI use cases within Citi. We obviously have a lot of broad productivity tools on top of our Citi Stylus and others, leveraging Gemini and other models. So that's broad productivity, and I'm genuinely impressed every time I'm going to different offices on how much people are using these and a variety of different things that we didn't even think of. Right?
And these sort of horizontal tools, everybody's got access to these.
Right, so we have about 237,000 people globally in Citi. We have about 180,000 people who are already using it. And Citi is a very diverse company, right? We physically have physical presence in 94 countries, and we operate in 180 countries, right? So Logan, you can understand the diversity of the languages, and that's needed. Like the multilingual aspect of it is pretty big for us, right? So one is this horizontal layer of productivity tools across. But then the big value unlocks come from specialized use cases that we deploy. And we have a very robust and very disciplined approach of looking at value creation. And value creation comes from growth, efficiency, and experiences that we can deliver. And you need to understand how to reimagine the whole process end to end. So within Citi, we are looking at this in a very top-down approach, saying here's where effort goes into the organization to take a complex use case like onboarding a client that is multiple countries and whatnot. It's a very manual process, a lot of paperwork and stuff like that historically. So when you start reimagining the whole process, you say, hey, now we have these tools that we have access to that we didn't have access to earlier. And I use a very simple analogy of when we got dishwashers in our house. We don't expect the dishwasher to stand up and rinse dishes the way humans did, right? We instead took a very human process. We added a step to it. We took out the next 5 steps, but now we have a very different outcome, and there's a lot higher quality of the output, right? But now we don't want to go back to washing dishes by hand. So a lot of our teams started off a few years back looking for a faster scrubber, But then it's a mind shift change when you get into, hey, I'm in the dishwasher era now, right? I need to rethink about how I'm delivering an output that's even better. So we're doing this across all the core operational processes across Citi. And that gives us an unfair advantage on how we serve our clients, how quickly we can get back to them, and so on and so forth. So and this is a very, very top-down run thing. Every Friday, we have the entire leadership looking at where are we infusing, where are we with looking at our operating model and AI levers that we can use to transform the way we do work, right? So this then manifests itself across, whether it's wealth management, how do you get advisor to be supercharged with AI serving recommendations, helping them with client research, so they're spending more time with the actual individual client. How do you look at customer care as an example, coming in, understanding what they need, helping the associate, so on and so forth. Looking at cross-border, a lot of the markets that we work in across have a lot of work that happens around unstructured content and so on and so forth. So across the board, we have found very meaningful material use cases that are being reimagined. Generative AI, machine learning models, robotic automation, process, policy, governance changes and stuff like that are needed. It's a holistic approach to looking at this versus trying to automate an existing process. So you are simplifying it, we're eliminating some steps, and then we are reimagining what the target state looks like. It takes a whole village to do this. We want the process engineers to be enabled with leveraging AI versus just the AI developers. But in the coding space, we'll get into some more examples later on. But that's how the core process will be very different in Citi in the next couple of years.
I love the dishwasher analogy. That's a good one.
Yeah, that's good. I hadn't heard that one.
Feeling it.
That's really helpful. And actually, analogies are powerful when you're trying to think about, helping people understand the way the world's sort of unfolding. Logan, obviously with Gemini 3, which is a quite recent launch, it's been called your most intelligent model yet. Enhanced reasoning, coding, multimodal understanding capabilities. I think it was Sundar, your CEO at Google and Alphabet, who recently described it as a very clear manifestation of an AI-first strategy tangible across multiple products. Can you just help us understand and our listeners understand what exactly makes Gemini 3 such a big leap forward? Is it agentic? Is it deep think? Is it something else?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think to Sundar's point, it's the sort of mixing of all these ingredients. And like to name a few of these, it's like the infrastructure scale that Google has training these models on TPUs, which is our sort of custom AI accelerator for both training and for inference, actually. It's also the sort of like what does that enable in practice is like this massive pre-training scale infrastructure. And again, for folks who don't know pre-training, it's like take a bunch of data, sort of the model generally learns world knowledge through the pre-training scale. And historically, there'd been this notion that like pre-training was not there was no longer any innovation to be had there. And I think as we continue to land these new models, the story for us continues to be actually when you have innovation across every layer of the stack, it sort of comes together, you put a bow on it, and it is this like frontier capable model that you wouldn't have been able to do by just innovating at one. Like if we had done a bunch of hardware innovation or done a bunch of post-training innovation, which is the process of like making models actually usable for humans, none of that is enough. You need it at every level. And I think that's sort of the ingredients that you mix together. And I think specifically for Gemini 3, it sort of transpires in, I think like three places: the coding capability and this tagline of being able to bring anything to life. I think I feel this viscerally, and I don't know for you both if you've played around with this, but like as I vibe code, as I try to like take some idea or concept that I have, or even something like we have all these good demos internally of just like really boring things brought to life in really interesting ways. Like you can take a picture of a receipt, and like this is not very practical and useful, but I think speaks to how capable the model is. You can take a picture of a receipt and it will turn the receipt into this like interactive visualization, and sort of you can like play around with the data and sort of move things around, and it's sort of like flowing in the wind, and like not super practical, but I think it gets to like the model just has such a rich understanding of all this stuff and can create this like with code in a lot of cases, this visual scaffolding to like bring ideas to life. And I think it's getting closer to this world. Gemini 3 is taking us closer to this world where like anything is like infinitely remixable. You take a picture on your wall, you take an email someone sent you, you take a video or an image you have, and you can sort of like transpose and remix and sort of combine and extend all of this information in ways that you don't like again, this goes back to what the mindset shift is. You don't look at your receipt and think this is like something that could be brought to life in some, I think of receipts and I'm
Correct.
like, I have to do my expenses. This is horrible.
It's humdrum.
Exactly. So there's something interesting about like being able to bring the mundane to life. And I think that gets me that like thread with Gemini 3 gets me really excited. And I think like agents is another one of those pieces of the story. So yeah, and then obviously Nano Banana Pro as well as part of that story, and not just like multimodal understanding, but multimodal generation and what happens when you combine world knowledge and Google search and all this other stuff into a single model. It's very special.
Those threads coming together.
And Logan, when we see the multimodal part that you're touching on, and you generally think of it as more media creation. So obviously within Citi, we do a lot of marketing and things of that nature. So those are no-brainer use cases. But if you start to understand, like a model's understanding what's happening on the screen, right? Just even computer use and other things, right? Just the fact that you can start to understand how a human did a particular process and reverse engineer that and say, hey, show me a video of how a process is happening, and I'll look at particular steps. And you can start to incorporate and say, hey, here's some places where we can start to automate or have AI transform the way this is done. Just that simple part of process discovery within model actually understanding all the different pieces and how it connects, like those unlock so much more value. It's not a sexy use case. It's not the shiniest thing of multimodal, but that alone is such a massive unlock for large enterprises like ours.
100%. I know we were talking to a startup that is trying to help companies do this as well, because I think it is such a, like everyone sort of vaguely understands that you should be using AI to help with these processes that you have. But like, unless you know, have like the city scale resources, sometimes it's difficult to know like what actually are those things. Like it's hard for me even sometimes as I'm doing my job daily to be like, take a step back and be like, what should I be using some tool to help me make sure that I do this more effectively, or rethink what I'm doing altogether. And I think that's actually been this has been my dream product, like work AI product for a long time. Is like, I want to click a button in my toolbar and just like have Gemini sort of omnipresent with me, with my consent, seeing the things that I see on a daily basis and just like proactively making suggestions. The proactive bit is, I think, the most transformative. And I think this is actually the qualm that a lot of people have on like the user side of AI products today, which is I have to, as the user, deliver all the right context to the AI system or model, and then actually be the one who's like taking the initiative. And like that is like, humans by default don't want to take initiative. That is the crux of the human condition. And like AI products should be sort of doing this and proactively reaching out and like actually going in a lot of cases and grabbing that relevant context and showing up with it. Like, again, that's my ideal product experience as a user of these tools.
That's fascinating. Shobhit, can you maybe kind of help us think about a concept that Logan mentioned in passing in one of his comments, vibe coding? Maybe just define what we're talking about, because not everybody's going to be on top of that phrase. What's that mean in a big organization? We've obviously got tens of thousands of developers, but also others who are not developers. Just paint us a bit of a picture, Shobhit.
Yes, I think with progress that models have made, especially Gemini 3s of the world, the threshold for a software developer, I grew up as a software developer, so the threshold of actually creating a functional software, a piece of software that does a particular thing end to end, it's fairly robust. That threshold has just been plummeting over time. And when you talk about vibe coding, it is me describing what I would have described to a technical PM who would then have assembled a team of people who would have gone out and coded. Now the equivalent of that is happening with AI, where I'm able to describe that here's what I would like it to do. I may not get into the nth level of detail around all the requirements, so I may just say that, hey, I need this in the Android material design, and that may be enough, and understand what that means. So there's, with natural language, being able to describe the final outcome of what you want. And the software engineering is happening at the back end. Like that, in my view, is what's vibe coding. And I have a very, my kids are young, and I can see them at this point starting to look at their mundane workflows and say, hey, I need to remember the capitals of every state in the country. And she will just go in and say, hey, Gemini, here's what I want to do. Make me flashcards. I'm going to click on it. I need the animal of the state at the back behind of it and stuff. And now we're moving towards the space of disposable, one-time use only apps. And I think, Logan, like I would love to hear from you on this, but I feel that enterprises will eventually start to get to that point, right? We spend a lot of money in getting all these third-party SaaS tools where it does 100 different things. But in my role, this particular month, all I care about is going in, doing a performance review, and coming out. I don't need the other 100 things on the screen. So I think the software experience itself, the way we interact with these tools at the back end, we would come to a point fairly soon where we're able to wipe code our way through it and say, hey, here's what my UX should look like. And that becomes a thin layer that is very, very transient and dynamic and suited to me as a person and just does a few things that I like, right? I think we've all come to a point where if we are putting somebody through a training program on how to use a software, that by definition is a dead on arrival, right? That should not be the case. We should be super intuitive and we should be able to define what the UX should look like. And I think that's where vibe coding is going. But Alex, just outside of the like people who are not software developers, that would be vibe coding. But I think there's a much bigger a portion of software development that happens in organizations like Citi, for example. We have over 30,000 developers, right? These guys, they are team members who write really solid, robust code with software development guidelines, and they have to have very robust testing mechanisms and so on and so forth. So we've had some really good access to these LLM models and multi-agent workflows in software development. So just to give you, we partner with third-party tools like Devin from Cognition and others. We have been able to go do things that took us like days worth of workflows in minutes or hours at this point, right? If you're looking at the amount of value that we can unlock, we have unlocked about 100,000 hours of productivity every week of developer time, right? And just look at the speed at which we can now serve our end customers and stuff, right? So I think that's the direction that is unlocking a massive amount of value for us. And then the vibe coding part will just reduce the threshold for people to start adding to that pool too.
Yeah, and I think there's two. The only thing I'll add, which I love, the 100,000 hours every week is ridiculous. That's crazy. There's like two angles of this. There's on one hand, there's fusing of a bunch of different role profiles, which I don't think we've historically you've seen like a product manager builds writes a spec or something and then hands it off to a designer who builds a bunch of designs something and then hands it off to an engineer. And then there's a lot of, it's a very fuzzy communication mechanism. There's a lot of back and forth. It takes a long time, all this stuff. And now you have sort of somebody, it could be anyone. They don't even have to be a product person. Can like actually just go and build the working version in an isolated environment of the thing that they actually want, and it is like a perfect manifestation of how that product should actually function. And then you can hand it off to design. You can hand it off to engineering, and sort of they know exactly what you're looking for. And I think we're actually seeing this inside of Google now, where this is like, for a lot of products, it's dramatically helping accelerate how they're building products internally inside of Google. So I'm really excited for that. And then I think, Shobhit, to your point about these like disposable apps, I think we actually are also getting closer to the world where people will not just do this in like a prototyping way, but like they'll actually build this as like a true way to accelerate the work that they're doing. And like one example of this is someone on our marketing team, we send emails to people about our product. And historically you get this like very boring CSV output of the data, and then that goes in an email to someone. And if you have questions, you have to email the person or set up time, and it's just this long process. They literally just took the CSV data, put it into AI Studio, vibe coded an app where I can now go in and like see a world visualization of where are people getting our emails, where are the best click-through rates, where are our customers. I can ask questions about the data. It was literally like 2 prompts, and like changes the way that I look at and interact with somebody who's on our marketing team. And I think we'll see more of like, not just, it is sort of a throwaway app in that context, but like people building the tools that they need to be more successful in the roles that they have, which again, I don't think is something like it changes the way that software is procured and built and all that stuff.
100%.
It's a real shift. And it's interesting you talked there about the building. I guess one of the things we've kind of come across talking with both institutional investors and also our corporate clients is that build versus buy dilemma, which itself has evolved a lot over the last 18 months. Maybe Shobhit, the complexity of that AI landscape today, it feels bewildering to many. You've got cloud, on-prem, open versus proprietary, frontier multimodal, smaller domain-specific models. How does Citi balance that flexibility, compliance, security, as well as where do we just spend our time? And I guess how do our corporate clients think about this?
Alex, within Citi, we've had a very robust approach on how do we build AI for the entire firm, right? And just to give you an order of the scale at which we're doing this, right? If you look at our business of moving money around the globe, on a daily basis, in a 24-hour period, we would move north of $5 trillion of money across the globe, right? So the scale at which we're doing this is insane. 180 countries, right? So we need to, just like Google does themselves too, right? We need to make sure that we are deploying at scale. Then there's a few principles around the control that's needed centrally. So we need to make sure that we have integrating the technology and cyber and legal and risk governance. All of that has to be in a controlled environment. So we know what are the guardrails we need to apply on demand and policies that change with each domain, each use case, each country that we're going in. Then AI, the access to AI, people want to get to it very, very quickly. So it has to be super simple to be able to build a use case from ideation all the way to scale and be able to go through a central API integrated platform. And that's what we have built in the center. So that way we can start to look at testing models like between, say, Gemini 2.5 and 3. Is it giving us a lift in the particular use case? Or like, how do we start to do that? It should be super, super simple. It has to be very multi-provider by definition for us, because there's just a multitude of innovation that's happening very, very rapidly. There are certain use cases where we do have geographic constraints and we do have to run things within an air-gapped environment and stuff. So you may need models that are running in your own infrastructure within that particular geographical boundary. And in certain cases, we would want to be using our hyperscalers as well. And by definition, as you look at these workloads for AI, they spike up and down very, very rapidly. So we need to have a very, very flexible way of scaling these AI agents and environments and then ramping them down. So being cloud first has been very critical for us, right? So overall, we have one central Citi AI platform that exposes all the generative AI for us. On top of that are sitting all the horizontal capabilities like Stylus and Assist and Squad and others. And on the same platform, we have all the specialized use cases as well. So now we have a central place where we are creating all of our MCP servers as an example, right? So if Stylus, if somebody, end user wants to access a particular backend system for, say, project management or for CRM and stuff, we will build that once in a central place and we can govern it. We can filter it. We can have all the policies in one spot. All your security and guardrails happen there. The same thing will get exposed when we build a specialized use case on top of it. Because we've already done it for Stylus, it gets exposed elsewhere too, right? So we're taking a very disciplined approach to this, centralizing guardrails. But Logan, to your earlier point, as the models get better, we have one place where we're going to plug in the latest models and all ships start rising, right? This also gives us an unfair advantage where we may have our banking business or credit card business may have the right AI talent to go build things that are very unique, very, very, very specialized. But now, since we're building it on the central platform, we are exposing them as capabilities as a service. So document creation should happen in one way, document comparison should happen in one way. And now all of a sudden, because this other group was building on top of it, maybe there's an operations team somewhere that does not have the budget or talent to do AI at scale, is able to leverage that as well. So now we have the Citi AI platform, we have capabilities as a service, and on top of that, we have all of our specialized use cases and our horizontal use cases. So that's our approach to solving for this multi-provider, multiple things happening, but that central platform gives us the speed and guardrails to then win that F1 race.
And of course, that operations team can take advantage of all the guardrails you've embedded. Logan, is anything you'd like to add to that in terms of how Google's approach helps firms like Citi and others, and obviously you have clients all around the world, kind of build trust and I guess ensure that responsible AI deployment that Shobhit was mentioning?
Yeah, I think there's two angles. I think part of your original question was this build versus buy conversation, which I think is really interesting. And it feels like what always ends up happening, and like maybe the cloud era historically before this was another example of this, like everyone ends up doing hybrid, which is like, oh, it's always the answer. It's like do hybrid, you build some
Bit
stuff.
of both.
You build some stuff, which I love. I think on the responsible deployment side, I think the only thing that I'll add is for us in the mainline Gemini models, it's not like all of the safety work that happens, all the responsibility work that happens is actually fundamentally not a it's not like a bolt-on extension of the model development process. It is the model development process. It's actually much easier in a lot of cases as well to solve this problem in the way that the models are built and trained versus model has some bad characteristic that you then try to filter out after the fact or try to convince the model it shouldn't do X, Y, and Z. So I think that sort of safety and reliability and responsibility piece is baked into the Gemini models, which I think hopefully makes it easier for customers to actually like make use of them and get them into these large scale.
And of course, many enterprises have known you for many years, as a counterparty. So there's that embedded trust as well. Maybe just switching gears, Shobhit, we've heard mentioned a number of times about Nano Banana. It's been a great multimodal model to date. How do you think about it in terms of an enabler, or AI, which is multimodal, as an enabler for creativity at work? And that's not just, of course, marketing and graphics, is it?
Yeah, and like I said earlier, is having a multimodal understanding of what's being discussed, understanding audio and text at the same time, or video. You get to a point where you can then start to have a conversation back and forth, and you understand the context a lot more. There's nuances of even audio, for example, the way somebody responded to hey, how are you doing? Like the tone and the way we are responding, we should be able to go change the way we
visuals,
respond
yes.
to that. Yeah, so there's a lot. Like humans are naturally looking and listening and looking for cues and body language, things of that nature. So I think that goes a long way of the multimodal understanding of what's happening in the conversation. Earlier, I mentioned a little bit about the computer use examples of understanding reverse engineering the processes and helping people like do the next set of things. But I think the language support in multimodal is a big one for us as too, right? Just given the global scale of Citi, we have a ton of use cases where, like even within stylus, we see people leveraging it in all kinds of different languages, and being able to take content in one and translating it with visuals and with the under, like all the commentary and all of that stuff, where if the model has been natively built on top of multiple languages, then it understands the nuances. It's not a word-to-word translation of the text, right? So I think we get a lot of
the essence is accurately translated.
Exactly, and that is very critical for us to serve our end clients in the language and the accent and the nuances of that particular country.
Fantastic. Logan, maybe I can just switch gears. From a broader AI development perspective, can you just touch on maybe some of the moonshot ideas or longer term research directions that Google Mind, DeepMind, etc. are thinking about? I know recently we heard from Sundar about Project Suncatcher. Anything specific to our industry, finance, or something, just kind of help our listeners imagine what the future might look like?
Yeah, well, I'll add one practical example of this, which I don't think is a super moonshot, but then I'll give you my moonshot ones as well.
We'll definitely take both.
The Nano Banana Pro story, I think, is actually really interesting, and I have a personal disdain for making slides. I think in the last 2 years I've been at Google, I've maybe contributed to 2 slide decks. My brain doesn't work that way. I find it very difficult to convey my own thoughts in that format. I think when other people make great slides, I'm like, I wish I could do that. And I think this. Historically, there hasn't been a way to sort of bridge that gap. And I think actually in the last couple of weeks, Nano Banana Pro has been helping me personally bridge that gap. And I can very quickly, because the text rendering capability and the editing capability is so good, I'm now using that inside of Google Slides to sort of get to the quality bar that I want, that's representative of my ideas, which is part of why I just visually haven't really liked what I've been able to do historically. And I think we'll continue to see that happen. And this trend, and I think we talked about vibe coding before, I think is going to happen. It's slowly happening across all of these different disciplines where the floor is being raised. And I think they're interesting. There'll be lots of weird places, and I don't actually know what these are off the top of my head, that will, the floor will be raised, and there'll be a bunch of really unique opportunities, and maybe it won't be super obvious initially that has actually happened because it's some edge case. And one example of this might be, really esoteric programming languages, or just languages in general, and super interesting opportunities because the models get good enough. The other one, and this is less moonshot, this feels like actually what's going to happen in 2026 is I think the models are finally getting good enough that people are actually going to have agents doing stuff. And then the long tail of what the next 10 years, assuming agents are successful at doing work in a very finite time constrained window, we'll see the trend we'll see out over the next 10 years is that window expands. So how frequently do you need to check in with some, and you have this with the sort of human analog right now today, which is how frequently do you need to check in with an employee who's doing some work on your behalf? You'll see this with agents as well, and that time horizon will expand dramatically. And then ultimately we'll see the sort of physical manifestation of this technology. And this is my favorite It's my favorite thing to think about. I live in Chicago. I look out on the Chicago skyline. I look out onto the streets of Chicago, and we've obviously made a tremendous amount of progress with AI in the last 3 years. As you look out in the physical landscape that we all inhabit, it looks identical. Like there is no, like if you were to sort of, if you,
The
if you
same
took
as
the
10 years ago.
picture
Yep.
today and you took the picture 3 years ago and you sort of went back in time and you asked everyone, is there super advanced AI technology in this picture that we're looking at? I think the answer would probably be no, because you can't tell. There's no physical manifestation. And I think we're just getting close to this physical manifestation actually start to happen, which I think will be really, really interesting to see, like AI for construction, AI for, a bunch of it, like self-driving cars, I think is one of those. Maybe actually you would, if you sort of had the right vantage point, you would see the Waymos driving themselves around in San Francisco, and then you'd maybe answer, yes, there is super advanced AI in this picture. Maybe
It's still
not.
limited, yeah. So that embodied AI, that physical AI notion, that's
Yeah, I think
extraordinary.
Logan, this the whole AI in the real world. I think Waymo is an incredible example. If you look at just the stats between a regular ride app driver and average driver for one of those versus Waymo, I've done this thought exercise with some of my teams to show if you look at just the pure outcomes, right? You look at number of say accidents, insurance claims, or things of that nature across a fully autonomous Waymo and an average driver that you would get from one of the ride apps, right? If you just start with the outcomes first, if you just lay that down on a screen and say, hey, pick driver A versus driver B, like the entire room ends up picking driver B, and then you reveal that driver B is actually in a fully autonomous car versus driver A is a regular human being. So I think just the quality controls and checks and balances that we put, and then within like real world like Waymo experiences, you've really pruned the search space down and said, hey, I'm not going to drop you everywhere. I'm going to drop you on these roads. Maybe I drop you at the intersection and you walk to the restaurant. Like, it's okay. It's safer for you to take 10 steps on your own versus we trying to get in and very, very clearly mark, here's the roads that we're going to prefer with Waymo. I think when we start rolling out AI in the real world, within Citi, within our enterprise, or in the real world like Waymo is doing, we have to be very receptive of making sure that we understand the constraints, and you should reduce those constraints space and say, for this particular example, it's going to do a really good job, right? So I think a little bit of that is learning. I think the world around us physically is going to start to adapt to it, and that's when you start to get more real world AI.
I love that point. I think that's spot on.
It's brilliant. Maybe actually in that kind of broader world kind of prism, Logan. I know you've talked previously about the importance of being human in a world of AI. How would you think about that, and how do you think that sort of we in enterprises and beyond, I guess, the enterprises, we put this technology to best use?
Yeah, my worldview is I'm so fundamentally bullish on humans. I think there's this. It's so easy to jump to this idea that massive AI advancement is somehow going to like fundamentally disrupt the fabric of like human society. I don't buy personally. I don't buy this idea. I think there will be change, and there's always change, and there's change. Like if you look at how people spend their time today versus how they did 20 years ago, like it looks different, and it didn't fundamentally change everything, and humans are still incredibly valuable in the world, and I think there's all these interesting opportunities. And this like the floor being raised, I think is this tailwind that I don't feel like people are sort of capturing and grabbing onto, but I see this in like some of the best people that I work with. The line between like what actually is their role continues to blur because they're embracing these tools, and they sort of have that generalist approach to solving problems, and they can. I think the great thing for people who are in this position is they now have more agency. I think historically like jobs are, you have some very finite constrained set of things that you're required to do, and hopefully you do them well, and that's what your job is. And I think now we're seeing that people are actually able to go outside those bounds and like in a really bunch of like magical and interesting ways do things they wouldn't have otherwise been able to do, empowered because these tools are sort of raising the floor for everyone. So I think that, and this takes me back to this washing machine analogy, or the dishwasher analogy. Like I love that because like what happens when you have a great dishwasher is like I still fundamentally get the work done, and it frees up my time to do things that are more hopefully economically productive or like enjoyable for me. And like I don't want to do my dishes, so it would be great that something else is doing them for me. And I think we'll see that trend play out, which is exciting because I think there is so much work in the world that people do want to do, and there's so much that they don't want to do, and hopefully it trends towards people spending time on the things they want.
Yeah, and I think so. Logan does this also then starts to become where AI is an equal opportunity enabler, right? If you think about the access to intelligence, the threshold has come down so drastically. You could have a kid in high school be able to go start a whole company, which was unimaginable because you had needed all these different roles to be played and stuff like that. Now you can augment yourself at scale, but you could be in a very elite school here in the US, and you could also be in a village in some other country and have access to the same set of intelligence and stuff. So it becomes a big level playing field. And if you look in our own corporate lives, right, we consistently in our corporate worlds always said that, hey, I'm incredibly good at doing my work. If only you could give me a team of 10 people, I can increase the economic output and I can get that promotion that I've been waiting for and prove to you that I can deliver more, right? This is the first time in our human history that we are able to actually manufacture those teams and say that, yes, I actually am really good at doing this. Let me show you. I do this across 10 accounts. Now I can do this across 100,000 accounts simultaneously, and I'll find you the insights, and then I'll show you the economic output that I can deliver. So I think if you look at our own personal trajectories and journeys, AI becomes a massive accelerator for you in your own career growth if you are able to harness it to generally reimagine how you're doing this and like amplify what you're really good at, right? So I feel that it's genuinely a equal opportunity enabler that we all need to embrace to be able to prove this out. They're saying that, hey, this actually is something real, and I can wield the power of doing this to augment what I'm doing and have that balance, right? There's certain things that a human does in the whole dishwashing process, right, that I don't expect a dishwasher to do. So just a mutual appreciation of where you augment each other very well, and then amplifying your human intelligence. And that's the direction that we should be thinking of as.
This early career bit as well, I think, is an interesting thread to pull. And I had a conversation actually with a bunch of university students, and I think it's so clear that if I think back 10 years ago when I was learning computer science, like basically you needed someone's permission at a company to like do an internship to actually learn anything useful. Like obviously you were learning like raw foundational skills in college, but like actually applying those in some reasonable setting, like you needed someone else's permission to do that. And it made the bar really difficult. Like I remember for myself learning computer science, it was difficult. You had to convince a random company that had a lot of things going on, they should spend the time with you to actually do something. And I think now you see students actually having the opportunity to like literally go and build the company that you're excited about building. And I think that's never been the case before because your skills were sort of outside of the realm of like actually doing useful stuff. And again, as that floor comes up, everyone is now able to like tackle more ambitious problems. And it's an exciting thing across the spectrum.
And maybe, Shobhit, I could just ask you to sort of gaze forward. And again, your role as head of AI at Citi, as you think about how these models get more powerful, how does Citi differentiate itself as others get access to the same models? And I guess, what does a future Citi look like? And maybe I could bring that back to how should we think about helping our enterprise clients? That's maybe one piece of advice both of you would give to enterprise leaders in thinking forward.
So I think it amplifies our core values, right? If you look at Citi is the global bank for the world, right? The scale at which we do this, the speed at which we deliver this with the right safeguards and the right skill sets of people behind it, and that's the differentiation that we would have. We will continue to be a delight to work with. If you think about the power of connecting the dots across everything that we do in the financial landscape, we can bring a really robust global view, and AI like starts to reduce the barriers between countries and become a world economy. I think that positions Citi really well in leveraging these technologies to reimagine how we serve our clients. So I think we'll just continue to deliver on the promise to our end clients. And I'm just generally very excited about the future direction that we take.
And what would be that sort of piece of advice for the enterprise leaders who are listening to this podcast going, what do I do next?
Yeah, you need to go fast but safe. Right, so you need to make sure, like if you think about it as a F1 race, right, there are guardrails in place for a reason. You cannot start a race if your brakes are not strong, right? And if you're getting into a curve and coming out of it, you're able to win that because you have a good safety net around you, and you know how the machine is going to react. It has been tuned, so it's a yin yang between the crew and the machine and the actual driver. So I think we need to embrace that in enterprises, create the right safeguards, go experiment, try things out within that sandbox, and that helps you accelerate. There's nothing better than actually feeling the power of these models, helping you with your day-to-day. So you need to democratize the access to these with the right safeguards around it. Logan, would you agree?
Yeah, and Shobhit, I was going to say based on this conversation, I now know how you're going to be spending this weekend, which is probably watching the last F1 race of the season,
Of
which
course, man.
I'd love to
Yes.
hear that. My only quick suggestion in addition is like betting on the exponential curve that these models are on, like from a core foundational like technology policy decision, the models are going to get much better. And like, what does that mean for your products and your company, et cetera, in a world where like the progress continues? Because I think for all intensive purposes and every sort of way in which you frame the problem, the models continue to get better. The progress continues to push forward. And I think there's no end in sight of that, which is really exciting. So how do you position yourself in a world where the technology, the progress we've seen in the last 2 years continues for the next 2 years? And I think it's often easy to like the whole AI is a bubble, is progress slowing down? Like all of these things end up being somewhat distractions in you being able to make that bet that the progress is going to continue.
Well, I'm sure that many of my listeners here would wish there was no end in sight to this episode, but I fear, unfortunately, we will have to draw to a close. But Logan, Shobhit, thank you both so much for what a fascinating discussion. I think we could have continued this for hours. Really appreciate it. We covered a lot of ground, but you were brilliant. So thank you both so much.
Thanks so much for having us here. And Logan, thanks for the partnership. It's been amazing working with Google.
Yeah, likewise. Hopefully lots of progress to continue and more stuff to talk about.
So we heard there from Logan and Shobhit talking about a number of amazing things in the world of AI. Doing the right AI and doing AI right. That was a phrase that really resonated from Shobhit. We heard from Logan talking about AI being proactive, looking out for you. That's the most transformative thing that we should think about in terms of AI heading forward. We heard Shobhit talking about the importance of multimodal AI, the way the model is going to keep working together as well into LLM, but also bringing in all these different forms of creative data, different models, text. That's the big change going forward. And also hearing from Logan how when we think about what the world looks like in forward 5 years, 10 years, how physical AI, or what we call embodied AI, may be one of the big changes. What we see when we look out the window is not just what's on our desktop. So lots to unpack, but a fascinating conversation. For more on this topic, do listen to the Citi Institute podcast. We've got a number on this particular topic, and obviously it's incredibly important. Also, do look up AI in investment management if you're interested in investment implications. That's again from Citi Institute, led by Helen Krause, or also Citi Institute on agentic AI. So take a look, and for Citi clients, do reach out to Heath Terry and Citi Research.
Citigroup, Citi and Google are not affiliated and are independent from each other. Google maintains a client relationship with Citi through Citi Cloud Technology Services. The speaker's views are their own and may not necessarily reflect the views of Citi or any of its affiliates. All opinions are subject to change without notice. Neither the information provided nor any opinion expressed constitutes a solicitation for the purchase or sale of any security. The expressions of opinion are not intended to be a forecast of future events or a guarantee of future results.